Hello, in this video I'll share my experience knitting a simple neck warmer with Flurry Yarn. I'll also be giving you tips along the way so that you won't have to go through the same mistakes that I made. I'm using Moda Vera Flurry Yarn and this is how it looks like. Okay, here comes tip number 1. If you're new to knitting, I really don't recommend using Flurry Yarn for 3 reasons. 1. It's extremely hard to see the stitches clearly because of all the fur. 2. The stitches tend to slip off the needles easily without you even knowing. And 3. The mistakes you make are almost impossible to rectify. For example, whenever I dropped a stitch, I wasn't able to find it because of all the fur, and I had to unravel everything and start all over. I have knitting experience and I had trouble with this yarn big time, so I really don't recommend it to knitting newbies. Tip number 2. Use large size needles. I used 7mm needles, even though, as you can see here, the label recommends you to use 4mm needles. This is how it looks like when I used 4mm needles. I found it was hard to see the stitches and it was hard to insert the knitting needle through them. So I switched to larger needles. I happen to have 7mm needles, which is the blue one over here, and I found it was so much easier. I could see the stitches more clearly and it was easier to jab in my needle through the stitches. And even though I'm using much larger size needles, you would see that the end product still looks beautiful. It's not like there's gonna be lots of holes. If you had used normal thread and a thin thread and knitted with 7mm needles, you would get lots of holes. But I'm putting my hand at the back and you couldn't see my hand. It's nice, it's fluffy, you don't see big spaces or loops hanging about. It's because all the fur from the Flurry yarn is filling up those spaces when you're using very large size needles to knit Flurry yarn, and you can see that all the fur makes the yarn, the thread that's connected to the fur, indistinguishable from the rest of the product. Tip number 3. I recommend that you begin with a project that requires very few stitches. It's faster to finish each row and it's less likely for you to miss a stitch. For my neck warmer, I only needed to cast on 12 stitches. Okay, tip number 4. Use long tail cast on. If you don't know what this is, there are many videos available on YouTube that can teach you how. I tried other types of cast on, but the results were disastrous. When I tried the knit cast on, all my stitches bunched up into an ugly mess. I wasn't able to spread them out on the needle. When I tried single cast on, it was easy to cast on, but when it came to knitting the first row, it was very hard to insert my needle into the stitches. So use long tail cast on. It's fast. Once you know the method, you'll find that it's so much easier and quicker. It's also easier to spread out the stitches evenly along the needle. And after casting on, I find it easier to insert my needle into the stitches to start knitting. So just as we normally do for cast on, we would begin with a slip knot. And you could see that the fur could be quite confusing, but I just treat it like I am working with a thin piece of thread. And okay, that's the slip knot. And then I take my needle, insert it through, and pull the yarn tight so that it doesn't slip off the needle. That is my first cast on stitch. So we move on to the second stitch. It really is easier than it looks because I'm trying to position my hand and the needle in front of the camera and getting the camera to focus clearly on the stitches so that you can see it. This is stitch number 2. Okay. And then all the fur looks confusing, but once you get the hang of it, you tend to ignore the fur and just concentrate on the yarn. So I have the third stitch now, and then I'm moving on to the 4th stitch. This is just to show you how it looks like when you do a long tail cast on with Flurry Yarn. If you find it difficult to follow or difficult to see the yarn over here, then please check out other videos on YouTube where they teach you how to do long tail cast on with normal yarn. Let me fast forward to the last stitch so that I can show you how I count my stitches after I finish casting on. So after casting on, I'm going to rotate the needle to show you how messy it looks like. You really can't see the stitches, can you? Okay, so let me count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 stitches. Now I'm replaying to show you that I pull the stitches as I count. So 1 pull, 2 pull, 3 pull. The reason I'm pulling is that the fur may cover the stitch that is on its left. So you may accidentally miss a stitch without knowing if you didn't pull the stitches as you are counting. And when you are counting, use your fingers to feel the yarn, because the feeling of the yarn is very much different from the feeling of the fur. The yarn is very distinct, whereas the fur is very soft. So if you use your sense of touch to feel the yarn as you are counting and pulling it away as you are counting, it would help to minimize the chances of you making a mistake in your counts. Tip number 5. Just knit every stitch. There is no need to purl because you can't see the stitches anyway after you've knitted. This is just to show you how I knit. So I look for the yarn, see the yarn over there with my needle. I insert my needle through and make 1 stitch. I use my fingers to feel the stitch on my left hand needle. Now I come to the next stitch. See the line over there? I insert my needle through and I make another stitch, and you just keep going on and on with the knit stitch. No need to purl at all. Tip number 6. Always keep your eyes on the stitches while you're knitting. I find this yarn has a tendency to slip off the needle tips. There were times when I looked away for a split second to talk to somebody or watch TV. The stitches near the tip of the needles, they just slipped off. They just slipped off without me even knowing. And once they slipped off, they disappeared into the mess of the fur. I only realized it after I finished the row, when I counted and found that I had fewer stitches. But by that time, it was too late. I couldn't figure out where the stitches dropped, and I ended up having to unravel everything to start from square one. So learn from my mistake. Never take your eyes off the stitches while knitting with Flurry yarn. If I were you, I would only do it after I've finished a row. And this brings us to tip number 7. Count the number of stitches on your needle whenever you finish a row. The advantage of doing this is that it helps you to cut your losses. You know it as soon as you've messed things up. So if you've messed up on the 5th row, you stop and unravel from there rather than you blindly continue to knit on, only to discover the mistake at, say, the 100th row. Imagine how much time and effort you would have wasted by then. It happened to me before, so learn from my mistake. So after finishing a row, I count my stitches. This is how it looks like. 1 pull, 2 pull, 3 pull, push away the fur, 4 pull, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So my project calls for 12 stitches. 12 stitches is correct. Okay, tip number 8. I only learned of this lifesaver when I was close to finishing my project. If you make lifelines every time you succeed with a couple of error-free rows, it will save you from having to unravel your work totally whenever you make a mistake. To make a lifeline, you will need one tapestry needle and a length of thread, which I would call your lifeline, about twice the length of your knitting needle. It's best you use a contrasting color for your lifeline. So assuming that you have knitted a few rows and you wish to make your lifeline, so that if anything goes wrong beyond the lifeline, you can go back to that row instead of the beginning, you thread in using your tapestry needle through the stitches. You thread the lifeline through the stitches using your tapestry needle, and you go through every single stitch that is currently on your knitting needle all the way to the end to make sure your lifeline has gone through all the stitches. So this is how it looks like when I've threaded the lifeline through all the stitches. You would see that I could pull the lifeline back and forth freely. This is to make sure you have not accidentally threaded the needle through some stitch somewhere and made a dead knot somewhere. The lifeline has to be able to move freely through all the stitches on your needle for it to work. Because later on, when you need to use it, then you need to make sure you go through following the lifeline to put back the stitches back onto your needle. Now I'm going to check that the number of stitches on my lifeline are correct. I need to make sure that the lifeline has gone through the stitch. So 1, I'm feeling the yarn carefully to make sure that it is over the lifeline, and you can see that I'm also pulling the fur to make sure that the lifeline has really gone through the stitch. Now this is going to be an example of a mistake I made. So you see, like over here, the lifeline did not go through the stitch. So this is wrong. I need to pull out the lifeline and redo this to make it right. Okay, so I've redone the lifeline and we are going to do a proper counting now. Okay, so there's 1, there's 2, you can see that it's over the lifeline, there's 3, 4, 5, so far so good. I'm being a bit confused by the fur. 6, okay, is this 2 or 1? Is this only 1 stitch? 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Great, 12 stitches on my lifeline, and I have to take the 2 ends of the lifeline, which is the 2 ends of the thread, and tie a dead knot. You have to tie a knot and make sure that the knot doesn't come out. So to use a lifeline, you keep unraveling until you reach the row where the lifeline is. You will know when you have reached it when you can no longer unravel the yarn because it feels like it's stuck, because the lifeline is preventing you from unraveling further. Then look at the stitches. You just can't see where they are, right? So take your knitting needle and look carefully at your lifeline. Look, this is actually the first stitch here. Imagine if you didn't have the lifeline, you wouldn't be able to distinguish the stitch from the rest of the fur. So with the lifeline, it helps you to get your stitches back onto your needle. And remember, after you have put back the stitches on your needle, you need to count to make sure you have not missed a stitch. If you have missed a stitch, you need to remove your knitting needle, not the lifeline, the knitting needle, and retrace the stitches using the lifeline. Alright, here's how my neck warmer looks like. It's about 24 inches long. I used less than one ball of yarn, and I think I still have about 2 meters left. I hope this video has been helpful to anyone who's had a hard time trying to knit with Flurry yarn. Have fun, and thanks for watching.